Well, thank you all for the invitation tonight. I have great respect for the CRES chapters and the CRES organization, and I appreciate everything you guys do. I want to stick closest to what I know about, and that's regulation. But I put a few slides together to sort of set the stage for the rest of this. This is the reading of carbon concentrations in the atmosphere measured at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. I'm pretty sure I was there the week that we punched through 400 parts per million. I realize fully that we're in a crowd where probably more than one of you is a member of 350.org. There's Martin is one of them. But I always bring myself back to the reality when I look at this graph. 650,000 years, we never went above 300 parts per million with all the cycling. And then beginning in essentially 1950, we punched through 300, and now we're punching through 400. So we've got a lot of work to do. One of the themes of tonight will be why we need the utility industry to get on track. A lot of you in this room are probably not fond of utilities. I'm not sure anyone really is. But a lot of you may think that we can do this without bringing them around, and I think that's a wrong idea. This is U.S. electricity production by source of fuel in 2014. No big news here. You've seen these pictures before. Note that the darkest blue piece there is renewables. And I've got a breakout of what that renewables is. About 62% of the renewables is wind. Biomass is about 25%. Solar is only about 4% of the 7%, which is renewables. So we are really at a very early stage. If you are, as I am, very bullish about solar, you need to keep in mind that 1 million rooftops is a wonderful thing, but it's not going to fight climate change. We've got to get on a much bigger scale than we're able to do at that level. This is a slide I love. Some of you probably have seen this. It was done by Bernstein Analysis. It's called Welcome to the Terrordome. Terrordome, if you don't know it, was a Public Enemy rap piece around 1990. In which the Terrordome was a black planet. So whites were supposed to be afraid of a black planet. That's where Terrordome came from. It was appropriated by Bernstein. So what you've got there is you've got the price from 49 through today of some important fossil fuels, coal, oil, liquefied natural gas. It's a Henry Hub price too. And then you've got the solar curve. And the interesting part there right now is this solar curve falling out of the sky, intersecting the costs of these other resources. What's kind of hard to believe is that thing is going to level off at some point. I mean, it can't go below zero, I don't think. It's certainly not far below zero. So in fact, that curve is going to flatten out, but it doesn't show any signs of doing that anytime soon. This is the most recent data on the cost of solar installations in the case of residential installs, non-residential commercial installs, utility fixed tilt, and utility tracking. These are numbers of record. They say up the top that these are modeled, but they're actually modeled based on the data, so I don't quite know what they mean by that. Importantly, at the time this measurement was done, and some of you may disagree with this, Colorado's a little bit better off than the country on average, but 350 a watt is not a bad number for residential solar in the scale of 3 to 5 kilowatts. Utility at much larger scale is a full $2 per watt lower than that. This is one of the reasons, I'm not arguing against doing small solar, but this is one of the reasons we have to appreciate why utility scale solar is important to us. Now these are upfront costs. This is overnight cost of installation. By the way, this is unsubsidized, so this does not involve any federal tax credits or anything else. Utilities are now below $1.50. They're probably getting close to $1.25. Utility tracking is a more expensive proposition because you're putting the mechanism to allow the panels to be tilted, and that produces a higher upfront cost. But as you probably all know, the energy production of a single axis field is so much higher that you actually have a lower per unit cost of kilowatt hours. This is DOE's estimate of where utility scale solar is headed. I said that they were at about $1. They're probably at about $1.35 or something like that right now. DOE expects that to get to $1 a watt. This is all in overnight costs. Again, no subsidies. These are real numbers. In case you need inspiration, I got mine a couple years ago when the National Renewable Energy Laboratory published a report, which report's history is almost as interesting as the report itself, because this report almost did not see the light of day. There were plenty of pressures in the system, not at NREL per se, but in the DOE system, that were trying to keep this tamer than it ended up being. The NREL report basically says that we can get to, well, I'll tell you what it says. There's a quote. Renewable electricity generation from technologies that are commercially available today in combination with a more flexible electric system is more than adequate to supply 80% of total U.S. electric generation in 2050 while meeting electricity demand on an hourly basis in every region of the country. Okay. Now, this is still a controversial thing to say in most circles where people are from the power industry, but I am beginning to understand, just from the work I'm doing, that this is in fact the case. So if you are ever doubtful about the argument that we can go to 100% renewable by 2050 or something like that, and I know there's some of you in the room who want to make that a ballot issue in Colorado, it's not crazy. Hawaii isn't crazy, and Hawaii has got a 100% renewable portfolio stand by 2045. If you haven't seen this report, I commend it to you. It's long. I think the executive summary is 85 pages, so stick with the executive summary. But it's a good report. You can get to it on the NREL website. Okay. Moving forward massively on renewables takes an understanding that a lot of executives in the utility industry don't have. I'm happy to say that Excel has seen the light on some of these issues, not all of them. But I got this little illustration I want to show you that I think is kind of mind-boggling. So you know the scales of justice. Well, how about the scales of utility costs? Okay, we're going to use a pan scale here. On that side, let's put a natural gas generating plant, let's say 750 megawatts, maybe 2 plants, whatever. 750 megawatts of gas. On this side, other side of the scale, we'll put the same gas plant plus a wind farm plus a solar field. Okay, loading up. The question is, which costs more? It turns out that a gas plant alone costs more than a gas plant plus a wind farm plus a solar field. Now, you're all scratching your head and saying, maybe you weren't saying this, but what's going on here? Okay, what's going on here is that and by the way, I'm not making this up. This came from Xcel Energy's last resource plan, in which they built some gas plants, but they also added 450 megawatts of wind and 150 megawatts of solar. Leslie, have I got the number right? I think so. And it turns out that those renewable resources save fuel at the gas plants. So you build the gas plant essentially for capacity, and then you don't run it unless you have to. The wind and the solar during the day fills in, and the net picture is you're spending less than if you had burned gas and generated. Now, I need to put a couple caveats in. This may not be true exactly today when natural gas is $2.50. Nobody thinks it's going to stay at those prices. And so this calculation was done over a window of time, I think of 30 years, I believe. And there's a natural gas forecast in there. You probably wouldn't argue with it. I'm just telling you that this fuel-saving notion works in the longer run. It doesn't necessarily work when natural gas is as dirt cheap as it is today. A couple of us, you've already heard Ron Lair's name mentioned. He and I share a hairline and a first name, basically. Ron was chairman of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission in the 80s. I was chairman in the 2007 to 2011. We got together and decided to run a project that was foundation funded called Utilities 2020. And this is about 2 years ago we started this. Utilities 2020 operated, it was foundation funded, run by two former Colorado regulators named Ron. We had a board of experts from around the country. Our goal was to explore new utility business models and figure out what regulatory models made it possible for utilities to move to these new ways of being and thinking. I interviewed personally about a dozen CEOs of the largest utilities in the country, traveled around the country and met with them. I was very pleased to get an hour to 2 hours of their time in each case, and I think that was a testament to how important they think this stuff is. What did we hear from them? Well, one of the things we heard was they want clearer, more consistent direction from state energy policies. We heard this over and over again. Just tell us what you want. Now, not all utilities behave that way. I understand. I probably was self-selecting some. I wouldn't call them progressive in any event. They noted that utilities have very little incentive for innovation or even for firm efficiency. Now, the reason that's true is that they're regulated today, for the most part, under a system which is usually criticized as cost-plus regulation. They get their money, they get their expenses paid back to them, and they get a return on the investment they make. And so, under that circumstance, one CEO said to me, look, why would I stick my neck out to do something which may shake this company up and make it more efficient when my upside is I get my money back? And any savings we get, they're going to take it away from me in the next rate case. And that's kind of true. I was a regulator, I did that. You reset rates every once in a while, and you true up, go back. Oftentimes rates are going up, but that's not because utility profits are going up, it's because their costs are going up. All right. So that's a big problem for them. Commissions, they think, need a much better understanding of their business. They were not bashful about talking about how little regulators actually knew what it meant to be in the utility business and what was needed. And they also said that they want certainty on climate policy. Now, this is 2 years old, but I think you will also understand that most of the utilities in this country are not opposing the Clean Power Plan. There are coal utilities which are, and leading the vanguard, the coal states. But by and large, I mean, the Edison Electric Institute, EEI, the Trade Association of Electric Utilities, is not fighting Clean Power Plan. And the utility executives we talked to, again, said, let's get the rules straight and we'll perform. We're good at following the rules. And finally, they want healthier working relationships with commissioners and staff. So what else is new? I mean, that's always been true. But it was a pretty potent explanation they gave me. So we're going to look at something from the UK. I've already, in the lobby, talked to a few of you about this. It's called RIO. We'll come to that in a minute. But my simple version of the contrast between how we regulate in this country and how others regulate, including the UK. In the UK, they ask the question, are we getting what we're paying for? So there's a real focus on outputs, on what the results of all this utility business is. We say something different here. We say, are we paying the correct amount for what we got? I mean, our focus is on rates. You know, what's the utility allowed to earn? It's a strange focus if you're inside of regulation. There's really a difference in those two things. One values the outputs and rewards utilities for the outputs. The other is utilities sort of do what they do, and then you come along a year later and figure out what the rates should be. So the starting point for this analysis is something called RIO, and that stands for regulation equals incentives plus innovation plus outputs. Kind of a catchy little phrase. But in the UK, what this means is they've devised a system of regulation which does not tie utility rates to the investment that utilities make. That's the first thing they sever. So they don't make more money simply by more steel on the ground. They also provide incentives. So if utility scores well on an annual report card, they get more money. And if they score poorly, they get less money. I won't go into the innovation part. It's complicated. I'm not sure it's going to work. But the outputs, and this is the most important, the UK system sets up a set of outcomes that the utilities must achieve. We don't do that here. I mean, as strange as it seems, we don't tie utility compensation to their achievements. And in particular, we don't set goals for them other than a statute comes along every once in a while. And every once in a while, you might have a regulator with a head on his shoulders who wants to get something done. But as a general matter, we don't have that connection. I know, again, it's just kind of like bearing the sins of regulation. But the UK really goes into this. And I'm now writing and researching and advocating, I've been testifying in some jurisdictions, over basically the theme that for better outcomes, let's reward utilities for performance. So it's called performance-based regulation, or PBR. I know Pabst Blue Ribbon is also called PBR, but that's just an unfortunate coincidence. This is a draft of an article that's coming out next month in Energy Biz magazine. Some of you may see that. So my basic proposal, and I'm borrowing from the British, and I'm putting it together with stuff we know about in the U.S., mostly from the telecom regulation days, something called revenue cap regulation. So let me just walk through this. It's kind of dry, but it's also important. The plan would operate for a meaningfully long period of time, such as 5 to 8 years. The reason you do that is that this business about utilities keeping profits from innovation and from improving their game, we want them to have the ability to hang on to those without, quote unquote, taking it away. Revenues would be capped and then adjusted each subsequent year according to an external index. A good starting point is to use the rate of inflation. Utility costs over time, utility prices over time, have pretty closely tracked with inflation. So let's just get it over with. Rather than having a rate case every once in a while and everybody pulling their hair out over that, which explains Ron Lair and my pate. But instead of that, let's just give them a trajectory of prices, revenues actually. This is what you're going to collect over the next 8 years per year. Now, here's what you're going to do for that. And you give them a set of outputs, essentially, and you grade them on how well they perform in those outputs. So actual revenues would then also be trued up or down annually to the cap. This is also called decoupling. You probably recognize this. In other words, selling more electricity won't actually help them make more money because the revenue cap is what they're going to get no matter how much they sell, which suddenly means, hey, maybe energy efficiency would be a good idea. It's cheaper than building more plants, and building more plants during the next 8 years isn't going to help us at all with our earnings. So let's do something for the customers that basically lowers our costs and their costs while we pick up this revenue. So I know there's a lot of moving parts here, but there's no reason utilities have to collect that much more in revenues to make a system like this work. It's basically taking what you're paying them today, doing it in a fashion that gives them the motivation that they lack today, breaking that tie between investment and revenues, and decoupling so that you don't have this bias towards selling more in order to make more. Doesn't work. Point 2 there is the incentives piece. I'm cutting through a lot of detail here, but essentially you set up a set of performance measures. Some are no-brainers, okay? Reliability, safety. I mean, nobody's going to argue with any of those. But why don't we say, how about, I don't know, carbon reduction? That would be a decent goal for a utility. And if they can reduce carbon, let's pay them. And if they reduce it more than the baseline we set, they get a bonus. Suddenly, people at that utility who have jobs which today aren't particularly profitable, namely their environmental compliance officers and people like that, and their energy efficiency units, suddenly those are going to become profit centers in the new world. Incentives could be one way, upside only, or two way, upside and downside, or a mix of those. And under my recommendations, the amount that is at play in the incentives is significant compared to total revenues. So not some little frosting on the cake, it's got some cake in it too. Finally, if there is an objection that, well, what happens if, Hurricane Sandy comes through? We're still locked into this system? No, obviously you don't need to do that. If you've got severe unanticipated needs. Xcel Energy doesn't ever really have unanticipated needs like this. I mean, we'll have a windstorm that'll take out a few towers or something like that. But here in the middle of the country, we're really not going to see much of that, as long as at the front end of this, you've set it up so that they know what the path forward is. One more slide. All right. This slide is a little complicated, but I think if you think about it, it'll make some sense. This is a two-dimensional analysis of how utilities make money, what they're motivated by, and how they make money, essentially. So, Chuck Goldman, I'm sure some of you know Chuck at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, concocted this idea, and so I've borrowed it. And Chuck says that the traditional IOU is down here in the bottom quadrant. Assets, that's what I was talking about, matter a lot to your profitability, how much you've invested. And on the vertical axis, you sell commodity to make money. So that's the traditional bias that we've built in to cost of service regulation. Now we can improve this a little bit by rate making variance, and here I'm thinking of decoupling. Just add decoupling to what we do now. And that means that utilities are less reluctant to do energy efficiency, but only by so much. Everybody who's dealt with these issues knows the limits of decoupling as a motivator. I'm not going to talk about this dot here. I'm going to the next one. Chuck puts performance-based regulation over there. So you've basically changed the motivation of the utility to look more at value of what they provide to people than assets. So you've moved along that horizontal axis away from investment and towards what they can give people, what they can provide to people. And nirvana here is what's called an energy service utility, where they don't think of themselves as kilowatt providers, kilowatt hour providers, but instead of energy services. You want light in your commercial building. Do you care whether it's kilowatt hours or more efficient lighting fixtures? Maybe not. I mean, not appealing to your environmental conscience, but just, no, I want light. So the utility would have, in this instance, the motivation to provide lighting as a service, and that might mean underwriting the cost of much more efficient lighting in a building, as an example. Chuck argues that you've got to get from where we are today to there, and I agree, and lots of thinkers in this field agree. What I think my work and others working with me, like Lair and others, are saying is it's easier to go from where we are today to a type of regulation which provides these incentives, and then climb the hill up to the energy services utility. Now, that's, a little perhaps hokey that the triangle works out this way. I set the points right. But thematically, that's what we think will work.